Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we're going to take a look at what we do after we've landed as we taxi to our gate and shut down our Airbus. We'll be doing this in the A320neo in Microsoft Flight Simulator using the latest development build of the A32NX mod, which I highly recommend if you'd like to enhance your Airbus experience in Microsoft Flight Simulator. As you can see, we are just coming in on our approach now in towards London. We'll be landing at London Heathrow onto runway 27 left. Seeing as that's where I did my taxi tutorial, I thought it would be good fun to arrive there again and set up our after landing flow and arrival there. As ever, this is not for any real world use, although I am a real world Airbus pilot. It's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. So we're going to cover what to do after you've landed, what you do when you get to your stand, and what sort of things we're looking for and what options you have. Right, let's get started. We're now here on our almost final approach to runway 27 left. Let's just fully configure for landing. So I'll put the gear down and the last stages of flap. Flaps 3, speed is still good, flaps full. We've armed our ground spoilers, we've got our lights on. Okay, so we need to think about where we want to go immediately after landing, because there's two options. Obviously we can go left off the runway or right, so you need to know roughly where you think you're going to want to go and park. Now there's two ways to have a think about this. If you bring up the VFR chart, so pressing V in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it will let you look at the chart here. So if you think you want to park, say, Terminal 3 up here, then I know I'm going to vacate to the right of the runway, or Terminal 2 back here. This is Terminal 4, so you might think I want to park down here, so I'll make my left turn. So you need to have some idea. It's a good idea to get that done in the cruise, obviously, not at this point on the approach. Alternatively, if you have Navigraph, of course, you may have a slightly better option available to you. As you can see here, we can see 27 left, and then we could choose our route after landing using the exact taxiway waypoints. Again, I have instructions on this in a tutorial on taxiing, and it could be that air traffic will tell you. So they may tell you to vacate to the right or the left if you don't know or you're unfamiliar, but if you're at an airport, you know they typically don't tell you which way to go because they assume you know roughly where you normally park. But you can just ask as well. There's no problem with just asking. So figure out which way you want to come off the runway, because what you don't want to do is come off the wrong way and then have to cross back over, because that will upset air traffic and everyone else. And of course in some airports there's not a choice. There's only one side of the runway where there's a terminal, especially obviously at smaller airports. So today I'm going to vacate to the right to go and park at Terminal 2 over here.
50, 40.
Okay, so we've now rolled out onto the runway. Let's take this exit here to the right. For your taxi speed, be careful. You can see I'm doing 13 knots, which is okay. You don't want to be doing more than sort of, well, it depends on the exit, but if it's wet, certainly 20 knots is a good aiming point for vacating, and if it's a tight turn you need to be down at below 15 knots. If it's a really high speed exit, which this one sort of is, you could be a bit faster in good conditions. And now of course you're going to be waiting for instructions from air traffic control. Before we can get those, an important point to make here is, if I go outside and show you, you need to get across this line. So we talk about this again in the taxi tutorial, but this is the stop bar and this is the start and end point of the side of the runway. So if we're sat here, no one can land behind us. They'd have to go around. We need to get ourselves over this line. So let's do that. Over a bit of a hill here. You do not want to be sitting with any part of your aeroplane over this line, because that will not make you very popular with air traffic control. So let's get ourselves over, and then if you're not sure and there's no one behind you or you have the space, then now's the time to bring it to a stop and think about where you're going to go next. Hopefully you'll have had some idea already. So what do we do once we've vacated the runway? Well, we don't need to be so visible anymore. We don't want to be blinding other pilots with all of our lights, so we'll turn the strobe lights back to auto. That means they'll now switch off. Those are the flashing lights on the wingtips and on the tail, so those are now off. We can turn off the landing lights, of course, because we have done our landing. We do not need those. We're going to leave the runway turn-off lights on, and the nose light, which should have actually been only set to taxi. So that's set to taxi for landing, and that was left at takeoff. My mistake. That should have been at taxi, and we're going to leave it at taxi for the taxi in, of course. The beacon stays on because that tells the ground crew the engines are running. That's our red light flashing away. Again, I have a taxi tutorial, a lighting tutorial where I talk about these things. The wing lights can be on or off. They don't really have much impact. In fog, you may consider having them on just to make your aeroplane a bit more visible. And the nav lights, of course, need to stay on. Great. So the lights are now under control. Now we're going to think about where we want to taxi. So we're going to go to, as I said, Terminal 2. If I go to my VFR chart, that means I can take a right turn here and then taxi up a left turn and park up on the stands over here. So that's all pretty straightforward. Again, this isn't a full taxi tutorial. This is just a sort of after landing flow. So let's make our right turn here. Again, the Airbus is very manoeuvrable, so as long as you're not going too fast, you'll have no trouble making a turn like this, as you can see. Always amazes me how manoeuvrable they are. You can see my registration left over from my last stream. I forget it saves that. Okay, so what are we going to do now? Well, pretty quickly we want to disarm those ground spoilers. Now, Microsoft seems to do that automatically, but they would normally be up like this, and therefore the spoilers would stay up. And they stay up in the real aircraft until you put them down again. So I'm going to do that, and that would put the spoilers down outside. Great. Now we want to bring the flaps up, so the flaps can come all the way to 0. And something I'll say at this point is do not be afraid to bring the airplane to a stop, especially if you're away from the runway like we are now, because it's a lot to do for one pilot. Normally the taxi and flow, one person will be driving the airplane very carefully, the other person will be doing the after landing parts that we're doing now. So if you're struggling, bring it to a stop, because there's too many things to do really. So I've done that now. So we've disarmed our ground spoilers, brought those flaps up, and whilst we're down here, think of it as a bit of a flow, turn the weather radar off. We don't want the predictive wind shit on because that will be running and that uses the weather radar. So even if you've got one engine running, that will mean the radar is in use. So we don't want that on now, and we want to turn the weather radar off into the middle position, off. This does depend on which weather radar system you have, but effectively turn off your weather radar and predictive wind shear. Now you're clear of the runway. You don't want to have the radiation going out on the ground. Spoilers are disarmed, flaps are at 0. You may have landed with the engine mode select in ignition in very rare situations, so that should be a norm. Next, over here on the transponder, we're going to put the TCAS to standby. Only the TCAS. TARA is when it will give you traffic alerts and resolutionary advisories, but that's only something that we need in flight. So we'll put that to standby now, and that means that it will stop displaying other aircraft on our screen. But importantly, the transponder needs to stay on. So that means air traffic control can still see us walk, and they can still see where we are, because they want to know what we're doing on the ground. They can use that to see us on the ground as we taxi around. It also logs you into all sorts of other systems. It's all far beyond my knowledge what actually goes on behind all that. Great, coming onto the overhead panel then, we've done our lights. You may have had engine anti-ice on for the approach, but you may not need that now. And the final thing you may want to do, especially if you are close to your parking stand, so our stand is over here, so not too far away, is you would start the APU to have it ready, because we need the auxiliary power unit, the little jet engine in the tail, up and running before we shut down the engines. Otherwise we won't have electrical power, and the airplane will go very dark when you turn off the engines. Now I'm going to just show you a few other things whilst we're here, because after all, this is to cover hopefully a few different situations of yours. We brought the flaps to 0 after landing, which is the most common thing you'll see, and you'll see it when you go travelling most likely. If the temperature outside was above 30 degrees, we wouldn't have done that. We would have left them at 1. So if you have landed and the temperature outside is above 30, which you can see down here, currently it's plus 15. If it was above 30 degrees, you'd leave it at 1. That's because when it's really hot, there is a chance of some of the sensors in the wing thinking that there's a leak in the hot air. And we use that hot air to heat the wings for anti-ice. But when it's very hot outside, it can cause problems with that system that senses any leaks in that hot air. So it will give you warnings and it has to be reset and so on. So if it's really hot outside, you'll notice Airbuses often leave the flaps down to just the one position like this, and that keeps the slats open like that. Now there is a slight issue with that, which we'll talk about in my next video. So this is going to lead into a video where I talk about turning around, what we do after we've shut down and get ready for the next flight straight away, which is of course on short haul, what you do most often. But there we go. There is another alternative, which is if we think we hit any birds, we would actually leave the flaps out at full, or wherever they were for landing, so that the engineers can inspect it properly. Because if you think you may have hit a bird on approach, you'll need the engineers to be able to look at the configuration of the aeroplane when the bird hit. So if the bird hit you while you had flap full out like this, then you would need to leave it at that so they can come and inspect it. And the final situation would be if you've flown through a lot of ice on final approach, which we know is very possible in Microsoft Flight Simulator. In that case, you may have ice built up along the leading edge of the flaps is possible, or behind the slats, so along here. And if you think you've got ice there, you also would not bring the flaps up because you don't want to crush it and cause problems for the mechanisms. The hydraulics are very powerful, but the metal is only so strong, so there's you've got to be a bit careful with it. So bring the flaps up normally. If it's very hot, leave it at 1. If you've had any ice or bird strikes, then you'll leave them where they are for landing. Today, none of those, thankfully, so let's bring all those flaps in. And the next thing we're going to talk about is single engine taxi. So you will have seen in larger airports, aircraft will taxi in on just one engine, and that is entirely possible to do in the Airbus, and it saves fuel, it's quieter, it's less pollution, it's great. The times to think about it are if you have nice flat taxiways like this. If you've got an airport with hills built into the taxiways, and some of them do, then you're better off leaving both engines running, because you will find that it's very hard to go uphill on one engine in the Airbus. It doesn't like it. It's underpowered on the ground on one engine, it's overpowered on 2 engines. So another reason it's a good idea to use single engine is if you find that you're taxiing along and the airplane is accelerating away from you in front of you. Because it will, on idle power, it will constantly accelerate ever so slightly in the Neo, and more so in the older engines, the IAE especially. If that's the case, then turning off one engine can make your life easier because you can stop using the brakes and the airplane is more under control. In older aircraft, you need to start the APU before you turn off the engine. In the Neo aircraft, we don't need to, and I'll explain why in a second. To turn off the engine for single engine taxi, it's very simple. We always turn off engine number 2. We don't turn off engine number 1. We use engine 1 all the time if we're doing single engine taxiing. That's the same for departing and for arriving. The other thing is, don't turn off the engine as soon as you've cleared the runway. You need to wait for it to cool down from flight temperatures, because of course it's been under a bit of heavy use on final approach. Your engine thrust will be up at 50% for the whole final approach, so it's no good just turning it off straight away. And the times vary depending on the engine, but if you give it roughly 3 minutes from when you've landed, that should give it a chance to cool down. If you use maximum reverse, you definitely need to give it 3 minutes from when you selected idle or forward idle. Okay, so today we are in a Neo, so we don't need to start the APU. We're just going to turn off the engine. So let's turn it off, no problem there. And now, the hydraulic page isn't shown in this airplane, but now you've got the green hydraulic system being powered by engine 1. We need to power the second hydraulic system, so we're going to turn on this yellow electric pump. We're going to turn that on. I think that's actually a white light in the real aircraft, but that could be one of those things I misremember. Yellow electric pump comes on, and that means the second hydraulic system is being powered by a hydraulic pump. And that way we are fully powered, and that's the reason we're going to use engine 1 for taxi, because we have no green electric pump up here. We just have a yellow electric pump for the hydraulics. You'll see there, just the engine pump for green. So if we were to use engine 2, we couldn't use engine, there's no pump to use the green system. It would have to be done through the PTU. Right, so now we have both hydraulic systems pressurized and we're on one engine. Much quieter, much more efficient, and quite typical these days. You'll find now that the airplane needs a bit of thrust to get moving on the ground, and it can be quite awkward to handle. If you've got slippery taxiways, lots of ice, again, you don't want to do this because you'll have asymmetric thrust. When you apply power, you'll find the airplane tries to slide sideways, so only do this in good conditions. Great. So why can we not have the APU running in a Neo? It's because of the fire protection systems aren't powered fully if you have an older aircraft. they were set up where if you turn off one engine, the airplane will actually reduce some of its electrical load, and then included some of the fire systems. Whereas now, in modern aircraft, the systems are set up such that you can just have one engine running. Okay. You can also turn off the LS button. We're not going to use that now as we taxi in. You can leave the flight directors alone. In the real aircraft, it would reset itself, although here it's actually got stuck, so that could be a just a glitch in this mod at the moment. Let's go and taxi to our stand. So release that parking brake, and you'll see now I'm going to have to use a bit of thrust. You don't want to use more than 40% even out here. And it's quite a heavy airplane, 60 tons, so it's taking a bit of thrust to get moving, and it will push the airplane to one side, so you're going to have to keep an eye on that, keep adjusting for it. Now we are approaching our stand. We're going to go and park on the left here. I'll just choose this stand straight ahead, nice and easy. So what are some things we need to do now? Well, as you get close to your stand, you need to check that you have accumulator pressure. So that's this top bit, accumulator, in the little green band. It should be there. The reason we check that is if we lose engine thrusts for any reason as we arrive on the stand, we want to make sure we still have the ability to brake. So by having some accumulator pressure there, it means that even without any more engine hydraulic pumps running, we will still have enough pressure to slow the aircraft and bring it to a stop. So it's quite important to us. We'll also, as we reach this point and we're pointing into the stand, there will be ground crew standing around. So I've talked about this in my lights video. We're going to turn off our last ground lights. Oh, no, not like that. Off. Leave the beacon on, very important, and leave the nav lights on, but we do not need any of the nose wheel lights. Otherwise, they're very bright and they will dazzle the ground crew. Here we go then, arriving to our stand. So we've checked, we've got accumulator pressure, and we've got the lights on. Now, as you can see, we haven't got the APU running. Very important we have that done before we get to this point. Master switch on, 3 seconds later you can press start. That will take a little time to spool up, so it's good to get that done before you turn on to stand. Again, get the yellow line in between the screens to get you onto the center line, which tends to work out pretty well. And a bit hard to judge the stopping point if you don't have any add-ons that do it. If you get the jet bridge to be just behind you like that, that should be a good start, so that can reach the door. But they're quite manoeuvrable. Normally we would have guidance up here to show us exactly where to go. Okay, so set that parking brake on. Then it's not good enough to just look at that switch. You need to also look up here and check that there is pressure on each of the wheels, because it is so important you don't accidentally not set it. Or what if this is just a switch after all? If this breaks, you need to know the airplane isn't going to go anywhere. So check up here, are these bars up? And you'll also get parking brake written on the ECAM here. Great stuff. Now we've done single engine taxi today, so I don't need that yellow electric pump anymore, so I can turn that off. Not critical to do it at this point, but that needs to go off at some point. And we'll just wait for our APU. You can see ground power is available. That's not realistic. In real life, they won't plug that in unless you specifically need it. They won't approach the airplane because we have our red beacon flashing, both on the top and underneath. And that's why we have one underneath as well, so the ground crew can see that and they won't approach the airplane until it is off. The reason is if you were standing on this side, as you can see, you don't know that the other engine's running. This engine looks off, but they will be looking at the red flashing beacon to know whether they can approach the airplane or not. So we're sitting here. That's why you want the APU running, because you don't want to sit on stand with your engine running. So the APU is now available. Make sure you have the green available light so you know it can take the electrical load. Great. So that is definitely available. Check it's available on here. Don't just turn off the engines. But there we go, it is. So let's turn off that engine number 1. Now the electrical power will transfer onto the auxiliary power unit, the APU. I can pretty much immediately turn off the seatbelt signs. It depends on your airline's policy for that, but yeah, the engines are now off. But the beacon we leave on until our N1 has slowed down. So as you can see, it's right down already. It's really slow. It doesn't slow down that quickly in real life. Something below 10% N1 is a good point. Think about turning off the beacon. That's when it should be safe for the ground crew to approach the aeroplane. Good. Now we're going to turn off those fuel pumps. We don't need those anymore. If you did a really short turnaround, you might leave them on, but there you go, they can go off. We are now going to set the transponder to Well, it depends. In Europe, 2000 is the code you put in, and then you set it to standby. That's a European thing to get it to log off the Eurocontrol systems. So that can now go to standby because we don't want air traffic seeing us anymore. We've parked, we're done. And that is us pretty much set up. As you can see, the MCDU has gone back to this page, which it would do after landing. It resets itself, and then you can set up for a whole new flight. It wouldn't keep this information in here. Something we will check though is position monitor, and you want to look at these numbers here. They shouldn't be too high. If you see that one of these numbers is over sort of 5.0, then one of them is probably broken or might need monitoring or replacing, and there's some charts we have to work out whether that's acceptable. Normally at this point they'll be within 1 or 2 miles, so that might say 1.0, 2.3, 1.8, something like that. If any of them say over 5, that could be a sign that there's a problem. That's not an exact number though. There is a chart we have to consult to work that out. So from here, we're simply going to think about setting up for our next flight, which I will do in another video soon. Like I said, we will look at the turnaround. It's something I've had requested a few times. I think it would be good fun to show you guys. So yeah, so this is an airplane pretty much set up for the turnarounds now. APU bleed can come on after you've warmed up your APU for a few minutes, and external power now available. You can turn that on. Even if you're going to use the APU bleed, in which case you need the APU on because that's providing air for the cabin, you can still use the ground power, and it will actually reduce the fuel burn on the auxiliary power unit because it takes some of the load off the generator. So this is not an uncommon configuration these days, especially as we need to keep air coming through the cabin for ventilation reasons at the moment especially. The final thing is, depending on your airline, the slides will be disarmed. It could be that you'll make a PA to the cabin crew as you're parking. It could be that the cabin crew do it when they feel the aircraft stop or they feel the seatbelt signs come off. It just depends on the airline. In this mod, it's tied into the beacon, I'm pretty sure. So you can see those white slide lights are no longer written there. So that is quite important, of course, because otherwise if the doors open, the slides would come out. So that is something else to be sure has happened, and something that we would look for to make sure that's all done properly. And there we have it, a brief look at what we do when we have landed and taxiing, and the sort of things we have to look for on the A320 aircraft. I hope that's been useful for you. As ever, any questions or comments, please do put them below the video. Feel free to join our Discord for more alerts about live streams and videos, and to ask questions. There's a great community there. Thank you all so much for passing 30,000 subscribers, and thank you to those of you who came along for the long haul mega flight we did. We did an 11-hour live stream from London to the Maldives. So I hope you enjoyed that. I absolutely had a blast. I really enjoyed it. So thank you all so much for coming along and watching this video. I hope to see you again in another video soon. Like I said, we'll be looking at the turnaround very soon, as well as other tutorials, as well as more live streams coming. So thank you very much. Do keep safe and well. Bye-bye.